Chapter 9, Genesis chapters 23 through 25. Isaac is the father of Israel. We begin the transition from Abraham to Isaac in Genesis chapter 23 with the death of Sarah at the age of 127. Abraham dies in chapter 25 at the ripe old age of 175. But in between those chapters, Abraham makes his senior household servant swear that he will travel back to his homeland to get a wife for his son Isaac, rather than pick one from the hated Canaanites, cursed by God since the days of the flood. The homeland Abraham refers to is not Babylon, but another region in Mesopotamia, Aram Naharaim, Aram of the two rivers, specifically the city of Nahor, in the same region where Terah and Abraham had settled at the end of chapter 11. The city is not mentioned before, but it looks like the city name is taken from Abraham's brother Nahor. One of the key ways to make sure the family line remains faithful to Yahweh is to prohibit intermarriage with people from pagan cultures. Intermarriage is a big no-no for the Israelites at various points in the Old Testament. For example, Ezra chapter 9 explicitly forbids it, and Solomon's marital miscues in 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 through 13 led to the division of the monarchy in the north and south. Intermarriage encourages spiritual infidelity, since devotion to a non-Israelite wife might lead to abandoning Yahweh and following her gods. Back to the action. Abraham makes his servant swear that he will go back home to find a wife for his son. The servant finds Isaac a wife rather quickly. Her name is Rebekah, and he finds her by a well. She turns out to be the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. The servant tells Rebekah's father, Bethuel, and Rebekah's brother, Laban, the story of why he is there. They basically say, well, we can't argue with Yahweh, so here you go, take Rebekah. The servant brings her to Isaac, and it's love at first sight. Now, Abraham can die peacefully, knowing his son has married the right kind of woman. After Abraham's death and a brief pit stop to look at Ishmael's descendants, in Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18, the seventh, these are the descendants of, section of Genesis, the action quickly moves to the account of Isaac's family line, the eighth descendants section in Genesis chapter 25, verse 19. Isaac channels Abraham. Here's the crazy thing. The account of the descendants of Abraham's son Isaac isn't about Isaac at all, but about his sons Jacob and Esau. Although maybe this isn't so crazy, seeing that the descendants of Terah section in chapter 11 verse 27 wasn't about Terah, but about his son Abraham. Most of the attention here goes to Jacob, whom we will get to in the next chapter. Isaac's 15 minutes of fame happened on Mount Moriah, and here he plays only a brief supporting role. The one exception is Genesis chapter 26, when Isaac and Rebekah take a trip to Gerar. Isaac is driven into a foreign land because of a famine. There he goes to meet the Philistine king Abimelech to get some help, but when he arrives, he is afraid that the Philistines will kill him and take his beautiful wife. So he tells Abimelech that Rebekah is really his sister. Sound familiar? Abraham did something similar in his day, twice actually. Once in chapter 12 in Egypt, willingly handing his wife over to Pharaoh, and another time, like Isaac, in Gerar, willing to hand his wife again, this time to another Abimelech, maybe the father or grandfather of Isaac's Abimelech. Isaac's a chip off the old block, and God's people just keep having these awkward run-ins with their neighbors. That's not the only connection to Abraham the writer makes. While in Gerar, God tells Isaac not to follow Abraham's footsteps to Egypt, but to stay put. Gerar is within Israel's future borders. God uses this opportunity to reiterate the promise made originally to Abraham that he will have land and children. Now that Abraham is dead, the promise is transferred to Abraham's son. The promise did not end with Abraham and God, isn't finished with his project of creating a new people. The promise is still valid for Abraham's descendants. The tenacity of God's promise keeping character will come to a head in the book of Exodus. God delivers the Israelites from Egyptian bondage for one reason: to keep his promise to Abraham in Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. Philistines? Here? This story refers to the king of Gerar as a Philistine in chapter 26, verse 1. According to the archaeological record, Philistines weren't living in this region at this time. They didn't make their way from Greece to Canaan until about 1200 BCE. The reference to the Philistines during the time of Abraham and Isaac is, in other words, anachronistic. Putting Philistines in the story is like putting a Confederate soldier in Braveheart. It doesn't fit historically. We see, once again, that the biblical stories reflect the realities of a later period. By the time these stories were written down in the way we have them today, the Philistines had been longtime enemies of Israel and occupants of Canaan for centuries. The writer simply took for granted that the Philistines had always been there, which makes perfect sense for a culture that could not consult a library or do a Google search. Or maybe the compilers of the Bible were well aware that the Philistines had not been around during Abraham's time. They just set them in Canaan to contemporize the story. This is more remotely possible, but the point remains the same. Either intentionally or unintentionally, Israel's ancient stories were written down for later audiences. Just like we mentioned before, this is another make Jesus a pale Renaissance European moment, a way to connect the Israel of the exile to their ancient past. The same principle goes for the Hebrew language as well. If you will, permit a small but interesting detour. People who study Hebrew for a living, yes, these people really exist, can see that the Hebrew language evolved from earlier forms. The Hebrew of the Bible is largely from the time of the kings of Israel, about 800 BCE and later. So, when Genesis tells stories, including Adam and Eve, it does so in a Hebrew that did not exist yet at the time the story is happening. Once again, this does not mean the stories were made up at this later time, but it does mean that as stories were passed down, they were continually transformed to reflect current times, in terms of both Hebrew language and the actual content. Genesis provides ample evidence that this book was written long after the setting for its stories. Detour over. The story about Isaac handing over his wife is all we see about Isaac in his adult years. He plays a brief supporting role as the focus turns to Jacob, or better, the tense relationship between Jacob and his elder brother Esau.